Hello everyone. Welcome to Introduction to Sociology 2. The module today that we are going to cover is on the sampling methods. So this particular session is going to focus on what sampling is, few related terminologies to understand the sampling method and its applications in various fields. So let's start. So understanding of a particular issue is from the research perspective is a scientific process. That scientific process needs scientific steps to be followed. Sampling is one of the scientific technique that needs to be understood. Let's start with the related terminologies that will help us to understand sampling method. The first term that we are going to try to understand is the population. The population which is denoted by capital N is the population of interest who shares specific characteristics in alignment with the research questions. So population is the entire group of people, objectives or items to be studied from where inferences or conclusions needs to be drawn. We say that population varies in size. That means we can be interested to understand the opinion about the whole city, a town or a village, or even the teachers of a school. So the term population varies from time to time depending on the type of problem we are trying to focus on. Now, when we talk about research, the survey through which we collect the data are of two types. The first process is known as the census method. The second one is the sampling method. The census method deals with the investigation of the entire population. Data are collected for each and every unit of the universe. Thus, it provides more accurate and exact information as no unit is left out. Now, when we talk about census method, as I said that census covers all the participants, all the respondents on whom we are trying to investigate, and that becomes tedious. Thus, there is a scientific process through which we collect data to make the data more representative for a larger population, and that's a smaller representation of the whole population, and that is what we call as sample. So sampling is a scientific process. It is to select a group, that is a sample, from where actual data would be collected for conducting the research. We also have the sampling frame, which talks about the actual collection of units. It is the list from which units are drawn for the sample. Now let us have a look in this picture where we see that the population of interest is a larger population, and we draw few of them to make it representative of the population of interest and form the sample. Say for example, we are trying to investigate the opinion of women on voting. Now to do so, opinion of women, we need to cover a larger geographical area, which becomes very tiresome and very tedious. At times it is challenging to reach all the respondents at every corner. Thus, we try to form a smaller group which is a representation of the larger population of interest, and thus we form the sample. Sample, which is also denoted by the small letter n, is a group of people, objects or items, or it can be said as a subset of population of interest whose data will be collected and used to describe the entire population of interest. It is selected from a larger group of people, that is the population, and it is done by using a predefined selection method. Now, this sample is the representative of the larger group. It helps us to generalize the findings from research sample to population as a whole. The basic need of why we utilize this scientific method of sampling is to overcome few challenges and to draw inferences or conclusion that will help us to generalize for the whole population. Now, there are challenges to make the sample, that means the representation, to be unbiased. For example, handling the sampling bias. Now, handling sampling bias means the researcher may have a tendency to favor the selection of the participants with particular characteristics, and it usually results a poor sampling plan. So, it is the result of a poor sampling plan where we do not have a predefined concept or a predefined plan to conduct the research. As a result, we see that sampling biases arise. The third one is where we see that there are a lot of non-responses of the respondents, and that could be of various reasons. Maybe the participant has no chance to appear for the interview. That would be one of the reasons, or maybe the participant is not available when we are trying to approach them to conduct our study. Now, this sampling method is used in both the quantitative and qualitative research. And we need to know that what is the exact need of utilizing this sampling method. So, sampling basically saves resources in terms of time and money, and it is most effective when the population contains infinite individuals. At the same time, sampling has its own limitations where biased sample leads to inaccurate interpretation and personal biasness of researcher leads to erroneous interpretation. So, to keep in our mind when we are trying to choose the sample or prepare the sample, we need to follow certain specifications or precautions. Now, there are different types of sampling. The first is the probability sampling, and then we have the non-probability sampling. Now, this probability sampling is again divided into different types. Say, for example, we have the simple random sampling method, we have the systematic random sampling method, we have the stratified random sampling method, we have the cluster sampling, and then multi-stage random sampling method. On the other hand, for non-probability sampling, we have the quota sampling, the purposive or the judgmental sampling, the convenience or the voluntary sampling, and the snowball sampling. We will try to look into each of these types and subtypes of sampling method, and we will try to come up with few examples to understand how these each methods differ from each other and its applicability. Now, before starting, we need to know if there is any difference between the types of sampling. So, in probability sampling, the sample is selected using the random methods and it is mainly used in quantitative research. Whereas in non-probability sampling, we see that the sample is selected in a non-random way, and this type of sampling is used in both qualitative and quantitative research. Coming down to what probability sampling means. The probability term itself speaks about every unit in the sample has the equal chances of being selected, and that's what is probability sampling about. There is another term we need to understand is the randomization. Now, randomization means suppose we flip a coin So a coin has two sides, the head and the tail, and we say that each side has the equal probability to be selected, either head or tail. Maybe if we roll a dice, the each side of the dice have equal possibility, that means 1/6 possibility of each side to be selected. And that is what is the main fundamental concept of this probability sampling, randomization. Now, randomization is the concept that helps us to explain what probability is. And probability is something that involves few criteria where each items or participants are selected or chosen in a randomly way, and all the participants have the equal chances of being selected. We will come down to the first type of sampling, probability sampling, that's simple random sampling method. Now, simple random sampling is one of the best probability sampling techniques so far. It helps us in saving time and resources, and it is the most reliable method of obtaining information where every single member of a population is chosen randomly and merely by chance. Each individual has same probability of being chosen, and it is more suitable when population is homogeneous. Say for example, we are talking about a lucky draw, and we have all of the individuals, the names of the individuals in a bowl with all the chits in the bowl. Now, every individual has the equal chances to be picked up, and that's one of the best example of simple random sampling. Now, what are the advantages of this type of sampling? It is more representative of the universe, and simple random sampling is free from personal bias and prejudices. It is a simple method to use, and it assists in assessing sampling error. On the other hand, the disadvantage of simple random sampling is if the units are widely dispersed, the sample becomes unrepresentative, and it is not applicable when the units are heterogeneous. Now, I'll just explain one point here where we talk about the homogeneity of the population and the heterogeneity of the population. If it is a homogeneous population, each of them has the equal chances of being selected. That means we will pick up the characteristics in a homogeneous manner. But then, if it is a heterogeneous population, then there are chances that errors arise because of the heterogeneity of the population. The next type of random sampling is the systematic random sampling. Now, in systematic random sampling method, the participants are chosen at regular intervals, and it requires the selection of a starting point for the sample and sample size. It is repeated at a regular intervals and has predefined range, hence it is least time consuming. Say for example, I'm trying to understand the behavior of the students who are participating in online education. Now, if I have a group of students who are homogeneous, say for example, I am going to look into the behavior of the primary school students on online education. And there, what I'm going to do is I will have the whole list of the students who are going to be a part of my study. I have to prepare a list, and every nth member of that sample frame will be selected to form my sample size. Systematic random sampling has its advantage where it says that it is a simple and convenient method, it is less time consuming, and it can be used in infinite population. Whereas the main disadvantage of systematic random sampling is, since it is a quasi-random sampling, the sample may be not a representative sample. The next type of probability sampling is the stratified random sampling. Let's have a look on the characteristics of stratified random sampling. Here, the population is divided into smaller groups or stratas with no overlapping but representative of the entire population. While sampling, these groups can be organized and then drawn a sample from each group separately. Samples are taken from each group or strata based on the ratio of the subgroup size to the total population. If the population is heterogeneous, we must go in for stratified random sampling. Now, to come up with an example, the best example is I'm trying to understand how or what the opinion is about online education among the students. Now, the students can be categorized as middle school students, high school students, college going students and university going students. And these are the different status that a researcher is forming to get a clear picture or a holistic picture about the opinion in terms of online classes. So, it will include a representation from all the categories or all the stratas. And we say that in stratified random sampling, each of the strata is a homogeneous group. So when we have the homogeneous group, what happens is we then take sample out of each of the group and we form our main sample. So basically the population is divided into few strata. That's the middle school group, the high school students group, the college going students group and the university students group. And from each of the group, we will draw sample to form a larger sample which should be the representative of the whole population. Stratified random sampling has its own advantages where it ensures to study of all the subpopulations separately. It is an optimum size of the sample and can be determined with a given cost, precision and reliability. It is a more precise sample and a representation of subgroups in the population. Here in stratified random sampling, the biases are reduced and is in a greater precised form. The disadvantage includes that there is a possibility of faulty stratification and hence the accuracy may be lost. The proportionate stratification requires accurate information on the proportion of population in each strata. The next type of probability sampling is the cluster sampling. Now, cluster, here we say that the researchers divide the entire population into sections or clusters that represent a population. Clusters are identified and included in a sample based on demographic parameters like age, sex, location, etc. And it makes sampling very simple for a survey creator to derive effective inference from the feedback. So let's come to an example. So we talked about stratification where we were dividing the population into different strata. So what we do is in stratification, the researcher divides the population into different strata and on the basis of the purpose of the research and the aims of the study. On the other hand, when we talk about cluster is something that naturally exists and we take representation from each of the clusters. For example, I'm trying to get the opinion about online education from an educational institution who have 10 branches across the country. Now, reaching all the 10 branches and getting hold of the students become a challenge. So what I'm trying to do is I am dividing those 10 sub area can be taken as or treated as the cluster. So what I will do, I will randomly pick up the clusters and the participants included in each of the clusters will be included in my sample. So the difference again with stratification is each group or the stratas, from strata we randomly select the individuals to form the sample. In cluster what happens is we randomly pick up the clusters but not the individuals from the clusters. So the clusters are randomly picked, chosen and to form the sample. Now coming to the advantages of cluster sampling. Cluster sampling is again a low cost sampling where the process is quite simple. The complete list of sampling units within the population is not required and it can estimate the characteristics of both the cluster and the population. Thus, it requires less resources. On the other hand, the main problem with cluster is the cluster members tends to be alike. Thus, each stage in cluster sampling introduces errors. So, the more stages we have, the more errors are introduced. And it is not as accurate as simple random sampling. The next type of probability sampling is the multi-stage sampling. Multi-stage sampling is a complex form of cluster sampling. Here the sampling is carried out in different stages and uses a variety of probability sampling methods. It is basically a combination of stratified, cluster and simple random sampling. For example, when we talk about the NFHS data, the NFHS data collection follows typically the multi-stage random sampling. Here, what we do is in urban area, in each stage we try to collect the data where we try to utilize the cluster or the stratification or the simple random method. And that is how from the ward level we come down to form the census block and then we identify the households. Multi-stage sampling has its advantages where it says the sampling frames available at higher stages but not for ultimate sampling units. There is a cost-efficient concept in multi-stage sampling and it is less time consuming and less resources are used in multi-stage sampling. Whereas talking about the limitations, we say that it is a difficult and complex method of sampling and it involves errors when we consider the primary stages. A subjective technique of sampling is what we call as multi-stage sampling. In a nutshell, thus we can say that when we talk about probability sampling, it's something where we talk about randomization, and most of these randomization can be followed when we talk about or when we consider the quantitative research. On the other hand, when we talk about the qualitative research, it is mostly that we use non-probability sampling. So, in non-probability sampling, the sample units are not chosen randomly, rather with the purpose of the researcher. It is actually formed through a deliberation of the researcher, thus a deliberately formed group. The first type of non-probability sampling is the quota sampling. Now, here the researchers create a sample involving individuals that represent a population. The researcher chooses individuals according to specific traits or qualities. Researchers decide and create that can be generalized to the entire population, and it is entirely based on researchers' knowledge of the population. Now, if I'm trying to understand the career objective of the students, I might form different quotas or different groups of individual. For example, in an educational institution, if there are around 10,000 students and we see that the juniors, the seniors and the one who are the freshers have different opinions about the career. And I as a researcher want to get a clear picture or an opinion about their career objective. And to do so, what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to get hold of the seniors, the juniors, the freshers in the proportion they are in the educational institution. For example, I have 10,000 individuals as my target population. Say I have around 3,500 of them who are part of the junior category. So in my sample, if I'm planning to have 1,000 of individuals as my sample size, then 350 will be the part from the juniors. Maybe 2,500 individuals are there as a part of the senior students. So what I'll do is 250 of them will be chosen as my sample, and the freshers may consist of another 2,500. So in my sample, 250 will be the individuals who will form my sample. Now, quota sampling has its advantages where it saves money and time, and it is convenient for fulfilling specific research purposes. It exactly represents the population of interest in terms of researchers' preference or interest of the study. But the disadvantage includes where quota sampling does not use random selection, thus it increases the potentiality for the bias. The higher potential for sampling bias reduces our ability to generalize from the sample to the population. The next type of non-probability sampling is the judgmental or the purposive sampling, which is again a popular one that has been used especially in social science and even in sociology. So it says that it is a selective or subjective sampling, and it is a form of non-probability sampling where the researchers rely on their own judgment when choosing members of the population to participate in their surveys. Say for example, if I'm trying to choose, if my study interest is on a particular purpose or a particular interest. For example, I'm trying to understand the particular behavior of the woman in terms of voting, and what I choose is I'm going to take into consideration the women who are above 18. So that way I have my own purpose and I will approach those individuals who are going to be a part of my study, not the individuals who are below 18 years of age. So with the purpose of fulfilling few of my criterias, I will approach the respondents, and that's part of purposive sampling. It has its own advantages where we say judgmental sampling enables the researcher to squeeze a lot of information out of the data that they have collected. It is extremely time and cost effective, and here it is applicable that we can approach the respondents directly. On the other hand, the disadvantage of purposive or judgmental sampling is it is prone to researchers' bias. The researchers use their personal judgment to select participants and units of measurement. Thus, it is challenging to convince an audience regarding generalization of the findings. The next type is the convenience sampling. So here the samples are drawn at the convenience of the investigator, and the investigator pick up cases which are easily available units, keeping the objectives in mind for the study. Here, for example, I'm trying to study about the consumer's behavior, and now the consumer's behavior who have used a particular product, if I'm talking about the individuals or the volunteers who want to participate or who want to share their opinions are free to participate. The researcher do not impose on anyone saying that individual needs to be a part of the study, and that is why it is called as a convenience sampling. Now, convenience sampling has its advantage where it is very useful for the pilot study, and the results that are easily available in convenience sampling is easy to handle. It processes of picking people in the most convenient and faster way to immediately get their reactions to a certain hot and controversial topic. Here, the time is needed in minimum and even the other resources. The disadvantage is that it involves high risks of selection bias, and it may provide misleading information, and it may not be a representative sample. There is a basic difference when we talk about convenience sampling and purposive sampling. So the researchers in convenience sampling have the leverage that can be identified and approached of the individuals with a little effort as possible. So there are often individuals that are geographically close to the researcher or those who have previously completed an online survey. That's part of convenience sampling. In purposive sampling, we see when the researchers thoroughly think through how they will establish a sample population, even if it is not statistically representative of the greater population at hand. As the name suggests, researchers went to this community on purpose because they think that these individuals fit the profile of the people that they need to reach. The last type, but the important type of non-probability sampling is the snowball sampling. Here, the initial group of the respondent are selected. As the name suggests, snowball, so what we try to do is in snowball sampling, we start with the individual and then we move on with the contact from that particular respondent. Say for example, we are trying to study on addiction behavior, or maybe the traits or characteristics or the socio-economic condition of the sex workers. And to do so, it is difficult for us as a researcher to identify our respondents. So we might have a link to start our study with one or two individuals and get more contacts through our respondents. The advantages of snowball sampling is it is really good for special small population and is useful in studies involving respondents who are rare to be found. The disadvantage is it takes more time and it's mostly not representative, and the members of the populations who are little known, disliked, or whose opinions conflict with the respondents have low probability of being included. Thus, when we talked about the different types of sampling method, we will just have a look from the qualitative research perspective, where we need to carefully consider the choice of the case or community and justify why the case is suitable for answering few research questions. Whether the case study which we are going to pick up reveals an unusual or neglected aspect, or it helps us to compare several similar or different cases. So we have, as a result of sampling, the sampling errors that makes a sample unrepresentative of its population, and it comprises difference between the sample and population that are due solely to the particular participants that have been selected. On the other hand, we also come up with non-sampling error, which arises due to various causes right from the beginning stage when we plan for the study. So what happens is sampling error can be reduced if we take a larger group of people, but non-sampling error needs to be minimized when we have to be alert before we plan for this. And the sources of non-sampling error is the non-response, the errors in measurement, that's the bias devices, and the coverage error, where we talk about the selected unit in the sampling frame is not interviewed or sampling frame covers ineligible unit. Thus, when we plan for sampling, as a scientific process, we have to plan in such a way so that we can be able to handle the different errors, the sampling error and the non-sampling error, keeping in mind that non-sampling error is difficult to consider and it brings out erroneous results. That way, we need to plan accordingly and move on with our research.